Thanks, Clay. Hi, my name is Dino Chiesa. Thanks for waiting. We were just waiting for the AV to get started, and here we go. This is Web 207 winning against EJB, competitive update on EJB, on J2EE, on using Microsoft technologies to compete against these things and how you can do it successfully. My name is Dino Chiesa. I'm with the Developer Solutions Group in Redmond. Actually, I don't live in Redmond. I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm poured into Redmond, and I'm a marketing guy in Redmond. I've been with Microsoft for about 18 months. I just started this marketing position in Redmond. Prior to that, I was with the East Region Technology Team, the U.S. East Region, which is most of the East Coast, New York, Boston, D.C., focusing on Windows DNA and in particular on competitive opportunities against EJB. Prior to my time with Microsoft, I was with IBM for about 8 years. And towards the end of that tenure, sold or advocated selling EJB, including their WebSphere product line. So I have some background in distributed middleware, in Corba, DCE, MQ series, most of the IBM products, including WebSphere, but then in general, EJB and J2EE as well. So today, here's the agenda that I'd like to cover over the next hour or so. What I'd like to do is quickly go over some basics. I always like to cover the basics. Some of you may have seen this before or may be familiar with what is in J2EE, what is EJB. I always like to cover this, though, in a larger audience such as this, so I'll do that quickly. Then we'll talk about kind of a status review of J2EE, what's happening in the marketplace, how the standards are moving along, what the vendors are doing, and so on. So kind of a status in the marketplace, and maybe some comments about what customers are doing as well. I will then offer some competitive tips for winning against J2EE and EJB with today's technology. That's today's technology, meaning what we used to call Windows DNA, including ASP, VB, COM Plus, and Windows 2000. Towards the end of this talk, I will talk briefly about how .NET compares to J2EE and why it changes the game significantly. And I'm pretty excited about .NET, and I hope you guys are too. So we'll see. I'll give you my opinion on how .NET puts us in a much better position versus Java, versus the enterprise Java technologies towards the end of this talk. And then finally, I'll offer you a big laundry list of resources, because I'm of the opinion that it's imperative to know what your competitor's strengths are, what the competitor is doing in order to be able to discuss that credibly with your customers and position our technologies and our products in opposition to them and illustrate why we are better. So you've got to understand that, and I'm going to offer some resources towards the end for you guys for you people to rely on to learn some more about the other guys and how we might compare, because I know you have a lot of free time and you're looking for that sort of thing. And then we'll wrap up. Okay, let's start out with a diagram of J2EE and EJB, and this is kind of an illustration of where EJB fits in and where J2EE fits in. Let's start with EJB. In the middle there, that big green box, I've labeled that the EJB server. And within the EJB server, which is this software server, live these different containers, the yellow things. They call them, in JavaSpeak, it's called the EJB container. There are different containers for entity beans and session beans. Those are the different kinds of objects, server-side objects, that the EJB model allows. An entity bean maps, it's most easily mapped to a row in a database, a single row in a single database. That's the most straightforward mapping. But really it's any entity, it's any business object. So you could imagine composing an entity, whether it's an EJB entity bean or some other entity in, for example, COM Plus, you can imagine composing that from data that's stored in different relational tables, different data stores entirely. Maybe some relational, maybe some not. So then that is what an entity bean is, and it lives within this thing called an entity bean container in EJB speak. The container the bean represents the business object. The container is responsible for providing services to that business object. Services such as transaction capabilities, persistence in the case of an entity bean, thread safety, synchronization, recoverability, life cycle services, starting up the object or instantiating the object when a client requests it, and destroying the object when the client no longer needs to use it, managing concurrency or sharing objects, which you generally don't do with entity beans, but you might with session beans. Session beans are the other main flavor of EJB, of Enterprise Java Bean in EJB version 1.1, and that would be served out of a different container. The reason it's different is because it's got different, well, it's actually got fewer services to render to the bean than, say, an entity bean container. An entity bean container's got to know about back-end data stores and how to persist data for that entity bean, whereas a session bean container generally does not. So the rest of this stuff is going to look familiar to you. There's a home and a remote interface on each of these different sorts of beans, interfaces that are exposed for each type of bean, and a client to these business objects, these back-end business objects, such as a servlet or JSP, would request the instantiation of one of these EJBs, one of these entity beans or session bean, would request the instantiation of them through the home interface. So call into this home interface, which is on the container, and say, look, I need this bean, and these might be the attributes. So I need this customer, and here's the customer ID number. Or I need this inventory record, and here's the inventory ID number, or whatever. Primarily, you're thinking there's a primary key. You're thinking there's a primary key, and it's used to retrieve some object. So that's going to be the mechanism by which you retrieve this entity bean or this session bean via the home interface. And then the client of that bean, the user of that business object, would then use that bean via what's called the remote interface, which is just what you think it is. It exposes, the remote interface comprises all the different business methods on those business objects. So in the J2EE model, now EJB is kind of described in that green space. So all of EJB, the specification from Sun, is described within that green space. And Sun looked at that and said, well, this is good. At least in Sun's mind, it's good. What they wanted to do is more broadly cover distributed application architectures and models, and so they coined this called J2EE, which is Java 2 Enterprise Edition, which includes EJB, but then some other stuff, including servlet and JSP. And I'll talk more about that later. I have some slides on each of these different technologies. But basically, think of EJB as the server side, the care and feeding environment for these beans, these business objects, either persistent business objects or non-persistent business objects. And think of J2EE as the larger architecture, which includes recommendations for how you're going to get access to those beans, for example, through servlets or through JSP, which is like ASP. And also how we're going to talk to mail systems, how you integrate with Corba, how you might use a naming service. All of these things I haven't quite shown in this picture, but that's what J2EE is. It's one step larger, kind of broader description of what enterprise applications ought to look like in Java. So that's the picture, and that's at that level. So what is J2EE? And these slides are, I'm going to go through them quickly, but these are for your reference. If you get this deck, you can use this for in front of customers to reposition Java on the enterprise side for them, because in many cases they're going to need that. They need you to reposition Java products. So you may want to use this. There's also speaker's notes and reference notes in the slide deck as well, so pick them up if you're interested. So what is J2EE? It's a bundle of these things, including the application programming model, the platform, a test suite, and a reference implementation, all wrapped up in a branding program by Sun. So what does each of that mean? Well, the application programming model is a multi-tiered application programming model. So browser, some server-side, dynamic scripting logic, perhaps JSP or servlet corresponding to ASP, and then a back-end server object environment, that would be EJB. and databases behind that. So that's the application programming model that we're talking about. And then more generally, you can apply that to not just browser, servlet, EJB, but for example, pervasive device like a telephone or some wireless connected device or a voice response unit. So it's not necessarily PC, browser with HTML pages. It could be any sort of client. So general clients on the front end. And then the platform, what we mean by that is all the different APIs and services. And I've kind of exploded those at the bottom of the screen. So EJB Servlet, JSP, the Java Web Server, and these other extraneous APIs that Sun's kind of bundled into that package into J2EE. They also add a test suite. This is for compliance for vendors that choose to implement J2EE. Sun has packaged up a test suite that can help these vendors verify that they've got a fully J2EE compliant implementation or product. And there's something like 6,400 different tests. I don't know exactly what they test for, but presumably it's run through these APIs and see if they return the things that they're defined to return in the specification. There's also a reference implementation, which is a lot of this is you'll see the model, the platform, and the test suite. You'll see that very commonly in different standards organizations. For example, Corba did that as well. Sun has gone beyond what Corba specified, though, in providing a reference implementation. So that's something that's a base implementation that supposedly conforms to J2EE and passes all the tests in the test suite, so that vendors, licensees of J2EE can evaluate and examine this reference implementation for how one vendor did it, and that would be Sun. That reference implementation isn't necessarily advertised as being highly scalable, but it does serve as the basis for a number of open source EJB and J2EE implementations. So people can get started easily and quickly. And you wrap that all up in a branding program. Sun wants to license that and charge you for licensing that. And the vendors that are licensing this thing are companies like IBM, Oracle, BEA. Those are probably the top three. iPlanet, which is Sun's, which is a company that Sun has a great equity stake in. It's a software company. The AOL Netscape partnership has licensed J2EE, obviously. And then there are a number of other companies, smaller players in that environment that have licensed J2EE. There are 20, last I counted this week, there were 20 licensees of J2EE, including all the pieces in there. So what's EJB? EJB is the specification for the server side. They're always coded in Java. They run in that middle tier. There's all the services, for example, that EJB renders to the beans that are contained within it. This is not an extension of Java Beans. Java Beans is a simple client-side component model for Java. Enterprise Java Beans is not a simple extension of Java Beans. It's not the same way that you might think of COM plus services are kind of composable with a base COM object. As long as it doesn't have a GUI rendering portion. It's not so simple in Java. You can't build a Java Bean and then drop it in an Enterprise Java Bean container and call it an Enterprise Java Bean and get persistence and transaction awareness and synchronization and thread safety. You just can't. They're totally different models. Tools that are set up to do Java Beans, which is a fairly simple, elegant model, are not capable of dealing with EJBs. You've got to have, there's a much smaller set of development tools that are available to the Java developer to write EJBs. It's also not Corba, and I wanted to point that out because some of the vendors are saying, hey, you guys have got Corba in your shop? Well, have you heard that EJB is the logical convergence of Java and Corba? So if you like Java and you like Corba, what you really want to get is EJB. That's a load of hooey, right? That's garbage. There is no Corba exposed in EJB. There are no Corba APIs. There's no forward compatibility. There's nothing that says if I've got a Corba app today, it's going to run in an EJB container. That's complete hooey. You've got to get retrained. You've got to understand a new model, a new metaphor. That is a way that the EJB vendors, by saying EJB is the best of Corba and Java or something like that, that's a way that they can bring along these people that bought into Corba and are not happy with it because the Corba vendors have kind of abandoned that ship and are moving over to this. So that's marketing speak. The technology says a different story. if you've got customers that are using Corba today, and they're being wooed or sold on EJB, you want to jump in there because moving to EJB is going to be just as hard for them as moving to, for example, DNA or a Microsoft platform. So jump on that. And finally, I'll point out that EJB was initially a clone of and a response to MTS. Any questions on EJB and what I've just covered there? Yes?
You mentioned IBM being a licensee. I remember reading a while back that they objected to the statement that Sun was now requiring production systems they found out.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, I heard that IBM was balking at the Sun license terms for J2EE and didn't like the requirement that Sun had that said vendors will have to pay for deployed servers that use J2EE. So that means if IBM sells 1,000 different servers, they're going to have to pay Sun 1,000 times whatever the royalty rate is. Not only is it money out of IBM's pocket, it's also sales figures. That's proprietary sales figures right into Sun's lap. And remember, Sun is competing with IBM on J2EE implementations with iPlanet. So obviously, IBM did not like this, and neither did BEA. Up until July, that was true. They were backing off, and they were laying down the gauntlet. IBM was just saying, no, not going to do it. I like Java, we like EJB, and we're going to continue to use it, but we're not paying this J2EE license thing. We're not going to sign up for that. We're not going to stand behind you, Sun, and say this is a good idea because we think those license terms are crap. Sun backed off. Sun backed down, and in the beginning of July of this year, it's after the big developer conference for Sun, both BEA and IBM, two probably of the biggest EJB vendors in the space, both signed on to the J2EE licensing terms because of the fact that Sun, number one, dropped the royalty terms completely, and number two, dropped the sales figure reporting terms. So Sun realized that they needed to preserve the Java brotherhood, or the Java family, as it were. And so they backed off on all their requirements, and the big boys got what they wanted. So basically, when I say IBM and BEA have licensed J2EE, it's a very thin license agreement that just says Sun will give them the J2EE technology as I've described it, and that's basically it. IBM doesn't have responsibilities now going back to Sun. IBM has, though, continued to say we're not going to call our products J2EE branded. We're not going to brand them with J2EE because we don't like Sun's brand. So they'll say things like, they will, if asked, they will say, yes, we are J2EE compliant. And that'll be an honest answer because they'll run the tests. But they're not going to market it that way. They're not going to advertise it that way. They're not going to get behind Sun's brand. So they still don't like Sun's branding program, though now they are officially listed on Sun's website as a licensee of the technology. I hope that wasn't too long-winded of an answer. I'm going to have to make things quicker if we want to get through this. All right, so what is JSP? Do I need to cover this stuff? Yes? Good, okay. JSP is Java Server Pages. This is a direct response to Microsoft's Active Server Pages. And if you think Active Server Pages with VB and HTML, it's the same thing in Java Server Pages. It looks very similar. In fact, in the initial revisions before 1.0 of JSP, even the arcane syntax, with all the percentage signs and equals and all these weird symbols, even that was replicated in JSP, although they have changed some of that in JSP now. So it's JIT compiled, just-in-time compiled on the server side and executed inline on the server side. That's quite different than ASP, today's ASP, which is not compiled, it's interpreted. So that's an advantage in today's technology of JSP over ASP. When it's compiled, when JSP is compiled, it's usually rendered as a servlet. So you do two things. You compile the JSP code, which looks like HTML with some other gunk in it, compile that into Java code, a Java servlet, and then that itself is then compiled, JIT compiled, and executed on that server side. So JSP runs within this JSP servlet engine, which is a bolt-on, a plug-in to any web server. So you can plug it into IIS, you can plug it into Netscape's web server, Apache. It comes, you can make it available in Java web server, and pretty much any web server has the ability to run JSP pages today.
Does that run the same JVM as the other service?
So the question is, does JSP run in the same JVM as other servlets? That's an implementation detail. So I suppose what you're referring to is, does each page run in a JVM, or can I get pooling there? If I have, say, a high volume or highly loaded site, thousands of users banging on this thing every minute, am I going to get 1,000 JVMs, 1,000 processes, or not? And the answer is, it's tunable in most production-ready or production-quality JSP engines. Now, in the open source ones, you can get at, for example, www.apache.org. You can pick up a JSP engine, I think it's called Tomcat, and that may not have the tuning capabilities where you can say, I want this many JVMs minimum and this many maximum, and run all the JSP logic and servlet logic within just that many. You may not have that in Tomcat. But you do have that in the WebSphere of the world, the WebLogic, and some of these other high-end JSP servlet engines. So good question. Another question?
You said it is JIT compiled and executed, but still any Java code is interpreted. Is it native compiled, or how is that?
So the question is, I said it was JIT compiled and then executed, but yes, there's a point there. It's still Java bytecode. So it's potentially compiled and executed as native code if you're using things like Hotspot or some JVM or servlet engine that supports that. So in the same way that if you're familiar with .NET, it'll JIT compile things and it'll run it in this, you'll produce this IL, which is then run within there. You've got the same kind of model here, and you can also step down to native code. So some sites, for example, will deploy all their write all their JSPs, author all their servlets, and then run them through a compiler. And what they get is, for example, on NT, a bunch of EXEs. So you won't see JSP on the website, but it'll be EXE code that's generated from a JSP. So good question. Yeah, it's fairly solid environment. I'll have more to say about that later. What's a Java servlet? So very parallel to JSP. If you think of it, I might call it think code behind for JSP. So with ASP, you're somewhat constrained. You may be familiar with this. You're somewhat constrained by the fact that you've got one file and you've got to munge everything in there. You've got HTML code, you got your function calls, any function calls that you're going to make in the VB script in ASP there, and you've got the inline code and so forth. And it tends to get pretty messy. And spaghetti is the food that I hear most often referred to when people are writing ASP code. So I'm not sure what that's all about. So spaghetti code with ASP, but JSP combined with servlet avoids that problem. So you can have a simple, clean JSP file, as clean as JSP or ASP can get, with HTML and some of those tags with square brackets and percentage signs and so forth, but fairly small amount of that, and they can call, in JSP, you can call out into generic Java code in the form of a servlet. Or vice versa, a servlet can call JSP, and that's the more commonly recommended model, where a servlet invokes a JSP for presentation back to the client. And that might be different JSPs for different languages or different styles or different authorization level or what have you. So a servlet can decide how to render different things and then just pass that rendering task, that HTML rendering task, off to a JSP. So all the stuff that applies to JSP applies to servlet, which means it's JIT compiled, it can be compiled natively, it runs in this engine that's attached to an HTTP server, it's very portable. In fact, I know of no JSP implementations that don't also come with servlet. So there's different names, but it's basically, think JSP with code behind. So that's what Java servlet is. The reason I want to spend time on Java servlet and on JSP, even though it's not mentioned in the title of this talk, is that EJB tends to be very complicated. And in our experience, in what we've found from talking with customers and from observing, from talking with analysts, is that JSP and servlet is the much more popular route to go for customers. A lot of them will say, well, I like Java, and I think enterprise Java seems like the right way to go, but I'm not really ready to swallow all this EJB stuff. Entity beans and session beans, it seems very complicated, and it is. And so customers, what they'll do is they'll adopt JSP and servlet, and they're pretty happy with that. So they'll attach their databases not via some more robust transactional distributed synchronized model like EJB, but via just database access, like JDBC. They'll just go directly at their databases with JDBC from Servlet or JSP, and they're happy with that. So that's definitely a problem. We got to compete against that in addition to the broader, the more glorious EJB. So what's JCP? JCP is not an API, in contrast to some of these things that I've talked about previously. JCP is Sun's Java community process, and this is the process by which Java technology is adopted into the Java standards world. And I use the term standard loosely. JCP, the process, is controlled almost completely by Sun and its designees. So it's not all Sun, and if you look at the descriptions of JCP, some of the defenders of Java will say, well, look, there are other companies on these approval boards and so forth, but they're all appointed by Sun. So Sun, in effect, has all the power in the Java community process. The point being that it's not an open standards process. It's not anything similar to a standards process that you might be familiar with from W3C or from some of the other standards bodies. Even with the recent revisions that were undertaken due to complaints such as those brought by IBM and those brought by actually a large number of people in the Java community. So one analyst commented after seeing the revision of JCP version 2.0 and talking to some of the participants, this is what they commented. They said, to accept JCP 2.0 as a genuinely open process requires you to believe in the benevolent stewardship of Sun over this technology that's important for so many of its competitors. And that's just, that's just too hard to do. People aren't going to believe that. So JCP, the process by which Java stuff gets standardized, is still controlled by Sun, and that still represents a problem. Sun is tenuously holding together the Java community with things like backing off the J2EE licensing terms that I talked about previously, and proposing this new JCP, and really doing a hard sell job to get people to buy into JCP for the good of Java, for the good of the Java community. So that's continuing, but tenuously. So one thing I want to point out is there's a lot of follow the leader going on here. And this is definitely something you should point out to your customers. A lot of customers either don't believe it or are unaware of it. Really, some of them express great surprise and disbelief when I say this to them, that Java technology in many cases is derivative of Microsoft technology, stuff that we've had out for years. So for example, JSP versus ASP, EJB to MTS. Now within EJB there's this API called JTS, the Java Transaction Service, which is more similar in name to MTS, but I would say that EJB in reality, despite the difference in name, is actually, in the initial revision, was actually closer to MTS and a response to MTS than just JTS. JTS is much simpler than MTS, and in that respect maybe MTS is misnamed. But when I say things like that EJB derives from MTS, and they actually reproduce some of the flaws that we had in MTS in EJB. Stuff that you would never put in there unless you were copying word for word off the other guy's paper. It's in there. It's in EJB. People still don't believe me. So that's something that you should bring to your customers. Likewise with J2EE, which is this grander model, how to tie everything together, directly derivative of and a response to DNA. And that is not what I think. That is what it is. That's what Sun did. Sun looked at DNA and said, we need to fix this. Sun's partner said, yeah, we agree, and we'll do some things. We'll do some work. We'll together in a bow. They gave that to Sun, and then Sun said, thanks a lot. We'd like to charge you money for it now. So that's how they treat their partners. JDBC, which is Sun's database connectivity standard, derives directly from, in name and concept, ODBC. Now, what we've done since ODBC, obviously, is ADO, which simplifies things greatly. One of the best tools in the programmer's toolbox, from my perspective. Sun hasn't responded to that yet. Sun has tweaked JDBC a little bit. They've added some connection pooling. They've added some different things, but it's still not what programmers really want. It's still not up to the level of programmer productivity as ADO is. So what Sun is doing now is getting together a standards request for what they're calling JDO. And what do you think that stands for? Java Data Objects, and that is their response to ADO. So this is years late, right? This is years after we've got ADO, and in fact, we're already introducing ADO Plus, the next generation. So there are 2 gens behind on this. And I'll have more to talk about that in particular later. I guess the general point of this is that if you want to talk about innovation, if you want to talk about leadership in the industry, if you want to talk about getting out there first with technology, Microsoft has been there every step of the way, and Java has been entirely responsive. They've been looking at what Microsoft does, and they post a response. Look at it and post a response. In some of these cases, they're improving, right? And they're improving on our model. For example, JSP Servlet improves on ASP and has some advantages in terms of code maintenance and the ability to design this code over what we've got in today's technology for ASP. So we'll give them that, but it's still derivative. We had a question?
Yeah, just curious, EJB is moving into the XML support like we are?
Good question. So is EJB moving into XML? Are they going to be supporting XML? We're supporting that, so it would stand to reason that Sun's going to do that, right? Since they don't know what else to do except follow us. Well, that's true, and I expect that they will, but Sun, they've got that 1 year lag time between when we release things and when they start talking about it. So expect to see that maybe in the next 6 to 8 months, where EJB comes out with something on XML. But the fact is, today, they don't.
They're actually running tours in Europe, all over Europe now, that they're talking on Java and XML, so I'd say they're here.
Yep, you're saying, so the comment was that somebody's running tours in Europe talking about Java and XML, so they're here. So who is this that's running tours in Europe?
I wouldn't remember the organization. I went to a Corva OMG session once, so I got on their mail
Yes.
list, so it's the same thing. It's
Certainly,
the exact organization.
yes. Certainly the Java world in general is embracing XML. And for example, IBM has been a leader in Java and XML with their XML4J library, their class library, which is probably the most popular XML parser in Java. Yes? Somebody's just dying to say something.
Is it Oasis?
I'm sorry? Oasis. I don't know about that. XML4J has then been given to the Apache organization. They renamed it Xerces. Xerces.
Oasis is kind of like distro.org.
Yeah, that's something different, I think. In the back, we have a comment?
What about SOAP?
What about SOAP? So let me get to that as soon as I finish with the Java XML stuff. So IBM has been embracing, IBM is trying to maintain an independent path. They see, if you could get inside IBM's head, here's what I think they're thinking. They looked at Sun and what they're doing with Java and J2EE and EJB, and they looked at the power of Java, the marketing vehicle, and said, we want to latch onto that. We want to hitch our wagon to that train, or whatever it is, to mix a metaphor. They want to jump on that Java bandwagon, and they did. But IBM yet wants to preserve its independence. They want to have independence in deciding what their application platform, what their software application platform will look like. And so IBM is pursuing XML much more aggressively than Sun is, for example, with J2EE. IBM is pursuing SOAP. To kind of refer to this question here, IBM is pursuing SOAP very aggressively and actually partnering more closely with Microsoft than they are with Sun on SOAP and web services and UDDI, which is a recent development. So IBM is maintaining its independence, still trying to play that Java card where it gets them into the account, or gets recognition, or gets value from the customer to say, IBM says Java's good, that's good. So as far as that goes, IBM uses Java to that end, but then tends to produce their own proprietary platform for software. Yes?
So it's clear that IBM had already one major flop with the San Francisco framework, which was the huge Java implementation. They were using EJB at that point.
Yeah, IBM's definitely got a colored past with in this space with Component Broker, San Francisco, and so forth. Okay, so lots more to go. Have I really been talking that long? Holy cow. Microsoft and J2EE. So this is a table that I put up, and if you've been to MGS, you may have seen this before. It's basically the same thing. Table that I put up in front of customers and saying, look, you've heard that J2EE or Sun's Java technology for the enterprise is the way to go for building your enterprise applications, but did you know that we've got more technology on our side than they've got on their side? And it matches up in fairly parallel fashion. We've got the in-process components, the server-side components, web server scripting, client-side scripting. We've got data access technologies, queuing. Basically, you run down the laundry list, and we've got those things covered. Exceptions in today's technology. One is the stateful object, the persistent server-side object, the thing that persists itself. And that is what in JavaSpeak is called entity beans, in particular container managed persistence entity beans, CMP entity beans. So we don't have a direct answer to that today. We don't have something that maps up very nicely to what Sun's got. We've looked at it, we tried, we examined and attempted to deliver something with IMDB, but didn't. We pulled back from that. And the reason we didn't was because it wasn't performing the way we wanted to. It wasn't delivering programmer productivity the way we'd wanted to for the performance tax that it rendered on applications. So we said, you know, interesting project to look at. We don't think it's quite ready. We're still working on it, but we don't have code that's out there. In contrast, Sun has released this stuff, and it's got the same problems. It's interesting, it performs really poorly, and the programmer productivity benefits aren't all there, but yet it's still out there, and it's still one of those checkboxes that we have empty, and the Java side has checked. So be aware of that. Now, the other thing that I think is a real difference is the code behind support that you get with JSP and Servlet that you don't have in today's ASP. And that's definitely something that that's probably, to me, that's the key area where we lag Sun in today's technology. On the right-hand column, I'll call your attention to some of these things that are highlighted. For example, there is no scripting language in J2EE. There's nothing that you can, you have to write in Java. And when you want to attach to an EJB or you want to administer an EJB thing, what you do is you write a Java program and then run it. And there is no scripting. There's no client-side scripting. Sun is doing some work integrating COM with the client side of J2EE, but that to me is less compelling. I mean, it's not as elegant a solution as, for example, VBScript with Windows Script Host. Yes?
Why don't you simply call a COM object on a server code behind
So the question is, I keep harping on this code behind thing and saying that this is where we lag the Java world. So why can't I just put a COM object and that's code behind, isn't it? Yes. But the COM object involves much heavier lifting in terms of programmer effort than just building an ASP page, which I think you'll admit. Not necessarily that that's a bad thing, because maybe you don't want it to be, you don't want people to just be doing this offhand. But the fact is that it's much easier to build these things in a Java world and get them JIT compiled, get them Xcopy deployed, which you can't do with COM, get them refreshed automatically. Those are the kinds of things, and I'll have more to say on that later, but those are the kinds of things that you can't do with ASP and COM. Sorry? What about scriptlets? You're suggesting that's one thing that I did not, exactly, that's one thing that I did not put on this slide that perhaps you could add. So I don't, you know, there's only so much that fits on a single slide. So this is my selection. But some of the other ones that I want to call your attention to are queued components, which is something that I think we undersell. We've got good stuff in COM Plus today in Windows 2000. That's really interesting and delivers real value. But Sun doesn't have anything interesting on that side. On eventing, with COM Plus events, we've got more good, solid value in there for programmers to make their job easier, to make building complex, enterprise-ready systems easier. And Java doesn't have anything interesting to say as far as COM Plus events. On the other side, XML, we had pointed out that J2EE doesn't specify a way to do XML, although there are open source XML implementations. For example, the Xerxes package from the Apache open source project. So maybe there's an asterisk on the XML column. You won't get it necessarily from your J2EE vendor, and you won't get it from Sun, but you may get it from some open source package or somewhere else. You'll get XML parsers and the capability that you may need there. So vendor review, I said we're 20 licensees. The key vendors really are IBM, BEA, and Oracle. I'd say that Sun with iPlanet is probably fourth on that list. If I had to rank them, the top three are very close, and it depends on which perspective you take. BEA probably sells the most in terms of Java-based application servers, and their product is called WebLogic Server, just Rev 2 version 5.1. IBM's probably got the most clout in the industry. They market the best, and WebSphere is maybe, perhaps, the best known brand out of all of them. But Oracle has got the closest and kind of sneakiest way to get into the account, because Oracle's so dominant on high-end database. They just kind of slide their app server in as a tag along to the database, and it's in there and it's hard to dislodge. Oracle doesn't really feature that product. They don't really try to make money, big money off of the application server product standing alone. Really, it's just an extra feature of their high-dollar, high-value database product. And then iPlanet comes in fourth probably on the list. And there are other vendors that offer EJB and Java-based application servers, but they're probably all fractional market shares, below 5-6% in the market. So you'll see them in your accounts. I'm not saying you won't see them, but it won't be universal across different geographies and districts. And then I pointed out that IBM and BEA just recently signed on. We talked about that already. What we're seeing, though, is consolidation in the market. The choice for EJB server becoming more limited, and the expectation is this will continue. Just recently, in August and July, we've seen a number of developments in this front. For example, Progress ceased development of their EJB-based application server called Aptivity, which did very well in benchmarks, which was well received in reviews, which the object experts of the world liked and valued, but they just didn't have the marketing muscle that Oracle had, or that IBM had, or even BEA had. So they just said, you know, we're out of the game. Sorry, we're not going to do it. And they're now reselling as an application server product some stuff from Iona, which Iona is the Corba vendor that you remember. That they've since switched over to EJB. Gemstone is another fallen warrior from the Corba days that released EJB support when EJB was specified. They were just acquired by a German firm called Brokat, which I understand. I mean, I haven't heard of these guys because I'm kind of U.S.-centric, but I understand that they're strong in the European financial markets. So there's some consolidation going on there. We had a comment? Internet banking. There you go. Pervasive killed Tango, which is kind of a lower-end EJB application server. But you're going to see more and more of this. So Sun touts this list where they say, look at all these different EJB vendors that are out there. Well, once you get beyond the first 5 or 6 vendors, basically everybody is obble. Every one of those vendors probably today is thinking, do I kill it or not? I mean, is it worth it to me to continue trying to conform to this EJB spec when the big guys are gobbling up all the market share, or what? Then you've got, from the low end, the open source guys. So you've got EJB application servers that are freely downloadable. And the low end is being eaten up by these free things in the same way that low end, maybe Windows servers are being eaten up by Linux. So there's a lot of pressure in that middle, and expect to see the middle market just kind of evaporate over time as the big guys expand and the smaller free guys push upward. Yes?
The promise of this was supposed to be code portability, and do you know if anybody seriously writing the EJB porting on a multiple platform?
So we had a question about code portability. Is anybody really doing this or what? And short answer is no, it's not reality. And could you hold that thought, because I have a couple of slides on that later in this presentation. Any other questions?
Actually, one of the thoughts about EJB servers is interoperability as well. Not only code compatibility, but also between different servers. So if you write theoretically one EJB, you could theoretically use it in different systems. But because of the way it was implemented, I don't think it's really going on.
That's right. So I'm not sure I quite got the distinction that you drew between code portability and interoperability. But yeah, those are two things that Sun touts as benefits of the EJB specification, the standard, that if everybody conforms to, we're going to get portability and we're going to get interoperability. But in fact, we've got neither. And that's been part of the reason that Sun came out with version 2 of the EJB spec. Now, EJB started out with some earlier revisions, went to version 1.0, and that's when you first started to see early vendor offerings. Then went to 1.1, and that was about 16 months ago, I guess, maybe May '99, and now version 2 just came out, has been, I think the review period has passed. It's not official yet, but this is circa July. Sun has added some new things, kind of updated the spec in order to improve code portability, and interoperability. And here are some of the things. So major revision of CMP, which is this container managed persistence, this idea that the container, the thing, the care and feeding environment can take care of persistence for your business objects. And that means you do, as a programmer, you do much less programming, much less coding. So it's a developer productivity benefit. Well, it turns out that it wasn't so beneficial, and there was this huge tax on performance. And so Sun went back to the drawing board on CMP to address some for example, what are some of the shortcomings? Well, we'll talk about those later. I got 2 slides on that, and I don't want to spoil the fun, but just wanted to point out that EJB v2 recognizes these shortcomings, recognizes that customers aren't really jumping onto CMP, and tries to fix that. The old CMP specification must also be supported. So this makes your EJB server a little bit gunkier, a little bit more complicated. Second major change in EJB v2 is message-driven beans. So you remember that tag on one of the previous slides on the table that said, where I said asynchronous invocation of business objects is not supported. Well, Sun looked at that and they got tired of seeing that checkbox empty on their side, and they said, okay, let's do message-driven beans. Very simple, doesn't fit cleanly, not kind of an elegant extension to session beans or entity beans that already exist in the spec. If you understand how queued components work, where given that you conform to certain requirements of asynchronously invocable components on the server side, you can just check a box and invoke that thing using the same metaphor, the same programming model, the same client-to-object model in queued components. It's not that in EJB's message bean, in the EJB v2 message-driven beans. Basically, message-driven beans, it means more than it compels the EJB server vendor to implement a polling loop to retrieve a message from a queue and then give it to an object which exposes exactly one method, which is on message. So when a message arrives, invoke this on message, give me this long byte stream, which is not an object, it's not a marshaled object, it's not the same interface that's exposed by a session bean, it's not a business interface that you define in IDL. It's just this thing, and it's got to walk through and parse and unmarshal that data stream, whatever it might be, and then invoke business methods, which then may be session beans or entity beans. So the point is that it's just a polling loop. That's what message-driven beans is. So Sun got tired of seeing this checkbox empty, and they said, let's put a polling loop in there, and so now it's in there in v2. It's going to be very simple, not a whole lot of utility there. It's going to save programmers 10 lines of code. But it's in there now, it's a checkbox. Okay, so the third thing that EJB v2 does is it specifies, in contrast to v1.1, specifies that RMI over IOP becomes compulsory. Vendors have to implement RMI over IOP as the distributed invocation protocol for these EJBs. Prior to this, it was suggested. It was suggested as a way that vendors could do it, but it was not mandated. And what that meant was vendors such as BEA, who looked at RMI over IOP and recognized it for the brain-damaged idea that it was, said, "No, don't want to do it. Don't see our customers getting a whole lot of benefit from that." Well, now they've got to do it. And this third thing is where we come into interoperability between EJB vendors being more, we're trying to get closer, Sun is trying to get closer to mandating that happen. It remains to be seen whether that's going to be easily done and whether there will be actual benefit. Think about RMI over IOP and what that really is. The analog, as you saw on that table that I had up, the analog in the Microsoft world is DCOM. So RMI over IOP is not just message invocation or method invocation. It's got to carry on context. It's got to carry with it transaction context, security context, other things like that. All the stuff that the interceptors handle in the COM+ world, that's got to be carried across that protocol. So that means not only do I have to do IOP, but I've got to get my transaction descriptors consistent between BEA, for example, and IBM. And that's not easily done. It's about as problematic as getting the transaction context the same between IBM and Microsoft. Okay, so it's not going to be simple. And what I expect you will see is that vendors will implement the bare minimum to conform with the spec. They'll say, yeah, we did RMI over IOP, but you don't get security, you don't get transactions, you don't get queue prioritization and all that stuff. You're going to get very bare minimum functionality, although again, it's one of those checkbox things. Okay, so that's the quick summary of EJB v2. I have a URL to the spec. If you guys aren't leery of directly touching a Sun website, you might want to go after that. I talked to some Microsoft people who say, I don't go to Sun websites, ever. But if you're not afraid of that, go on that one. Or if you know someone who doesn't work for Microsoft, you can tell them to go to the website and get you the spec. I think I also got a draft of the PDF file and archived it. So in the resources that I have at the end of this presentation, you can pick it up from my Microsoft Share. And finally, I'll offer that comment. V2 of EJB spec is probably the last chance for EJB to get established in the enterprise computing space. Now that may be something, that may be a statement that's a little bit surprising. I was a little bit surprised by that at first. But the point I think TechMetrics, this analyst site, is making, the point they're making is EJB is complicated. A lot of companies have grabbed onto JSP and Servlet, but are a little bit leery of EJB. They're not really sure how to apply session beans and entity beans successfully, especially when you talk about the different flavors of entity beans, whether to go container managed persistence or bean managed persistence. I mean, it all sounds so complicated, and it is. And what TechMetrics is saying is that that complexity makes it hard for customers to say yes to using EJB in real projects. They say yes to the idea. They say yes to J2EE, and then they buy the product and they say, well, let's just walk before we can run. Let's do JSP and Servlet. And a lot of them never get beyond that. They never get beyond the simple dynamic scripting environment for web servers in JSP and Servlet. Yes? Did I say that there were not very many tools? I'd stick by that statement. There probably are not very many tools. What I'm seeing is, what we're seeing in the industry is the tools are not general purpose. So the promise of the spec, again, was portability and interoperability. This thing that, you know, you just code to EJB and then pick your server. It's totally independent. You know, your development can be independent of your runtime deployment decision. And it's not working out that way. In fact, most of the tools that are out there are specifically geared to one EJB server. So for example, with BEA WebLogic, they got with, geez, I can't remember the venture capital firm at this point, some Wall Street firm, and started a new company called WebGain that builds Java tools. And what do you know? It builds a Java development tool, an EJB development tool that is specifically suited to WebLogic EJB development. It does not work, for example, with IBM WebSphere's EJB server. Likewise, IBM has an EJB server called WebSphere, and their tool is called Visual Age for Java. Visual Age for Java bundles inside the tool the WebSphere runtime. So if you want to build and develop EJBs and you're using Visual Age for Java, you are using IBM WebSphere. That's all there is to it. Now it's possible to do, you know, some goofy things and try to bolt on a different EJB class library into Visual Age for Java, but it's not easy to do. It's not easily done, and all the extra tool wizards and so forth don't work. So basically, what you've got is a one-to-one tool-to-server mapping. You don't have this, you know, this openness, this interoperability among tools and servers and portability of code. It just doesn't happen, and that's because each vendor has extended EJB in kind of critical ways that make it non-portable, make the development environments non-portable. Somebody had some questions.
With SilverStream, is it not that once they develop on the SilverStream tool, they must have the SilverStream app server, which they give the tool almost away, but the app server must just be $20,000 a pop.
Exactly. So the point is, SilverStream is another illustration of that tight bundling between tool and application server. And that's absolutely true. SilverStream is one of those people that said, yeah, we've got this tool, it's totally proprietary, and we do a lot of neat things with it. It might be rapid application development for the server, but it's not necessarily standard in any way, and we don't want it to be standard because we think we've got a good thing here. We think this is not a commodity technology. We think we're giving some advantage to people. So let's latch on to J2EE or EJB and say we support it, but basically give them the same tool that they've already got and get them tightly bundled in. Once they use our tool, they got to use our server. It's the same thing. And you see that over and over again. Now, Enprise is a vendor that is a little bit different. We are seeing some companies use, or some customers using the Enprise development tool set for non-Enprise application servers. And Enprise specifically wanted to do that because, well, I suppose that they're in somewhat of desperate straits. You know, they've always had strength in tools and never really had a whole lot of strength on the server side. So what they've got is this ability to be used in different EJB environments. But that's definitely on the lower end. Enprise has the Visogenic orb, which is, yes, exactly. And they're trying to build with that orb and some of the other insides, the Enprise application server. I mean, they have built it and they have that product, which is an EJB application server, but not in that first tier, I would say, of vendors. Yes?
I'm sorry to cover this, but if someone conforms to version 2, will they then have platform independence?
Hard to say. So the question is, if V2 comes out, and it's likely to go final in December, V2 comes out and then vendors grab it and say, okay, let's implement it. Are we going to get the full portability, the promise of interoperability and portability that we always wanted? And I think the answer there is, well, my answer is I'm not really sure, to be honest, but my instinct, and it's a very strong one, is no way. It's not going to happen. And the reason for that is, again, the vendors want proprietary. The vendors want to get those customers sold, and they want, once they're sold, they want them sticking. I sell you this stuff, and I want you to never, ever, ever leave me. Never leave me. I want you to marry me forever. So Silverstream says, try this tool, you'll love it. We'll give it away, it's really cheap. You know, and people start to like the tool, and then it's like, okay, here's the server side, and you're going to have to pay me a lot of money. But people don't want to back off the tool, so they pay the money. Same thing with IBM, same thing with BEA. Everybody wants to get them bundled in early and wants to get them committed. So IBM is, as I said, they want to maintain independence of the software application platform, and that is primarily to gain that proprietariness, to get the customer to stay with them once they committed. So they'll use IBM's XML stuff. They'll use IBM's tool set, which is different and not quite the same as everybody else's. They'll use IBM's host integration stuff, which is different, and get them bundled in. So you know, people are going to say, yeah, this is going to improve. V2 will improve interoperability and portability, but the reality is, nobody wants that to happen. None of the people in control, none of the vendors want that to happen. They only want it to seem like that's what we're doing. So that's my insider's opinion. Yes? So what about Sun's acquisition of Forte software? And I understand that's being rolled into the iPlanet tool set. So in the same way that kind of IBM has had Visual Age as a development tool environment. It's never very popular. Visual Studio trounced it in the marketplace. But IBM got this WebSphere server side, and they said, we're going to need tools. And they converted Visual Age, and they rebadged it, and now it is the tool for WebSphere. BEA was looking at IBM and saying, ooh, they got integrated tools. We better get that too. And so they formed a new company and bought Semantics Visual Cafe, an existing Java tool, got it integrated more tightly with BEA WebLogic, and now they've got an integrated tool and server. Sun is doing the same thing with iPlanet. They're looking at it and saying, you know, the reality of portability and this plethora of Java tools isn't happening. We're going to need to make sure that we have an integrated story too, and that's where they're trying to go. Now, Forte is a little bit different than some of these other Java dev tools, but it's going to be part of the iPlanet tool offering, whether it's licensed or marketed as an iPlanet tool. Not here, you know, they may be one of these BEA WebGain things, whereas WebGain is mostly owned by BEA, but it is a separate company. It may be one of those kind of arrangements, but you will see tight integration. Yes?
Do you know what happens with J++? Nobody is talking about J++ anymore.
What happens with J++? Nobody's talking about it anymore. I don't know. I'm not talking about it, that's for sure. I don't mean to dismiss your question. I just don't know. I really can't offer any substantive comments. Anybody else?
I think Rational might be good.
I've heard rumors about Rational too, but I don't know that it's going to be J++ and the guys that you're familiar with today. If your question is more generally, is Java going to be supported on .NET, then I would say that's a good bet, but perhaps not directly by Microsoft.
The probable strategy would be once the S.NET is out, Rational can come out with a plugin for an add-on where programmers can write Java code.
Exactly. So that's a very common scenario, and if I was a betting person, I might bet on that, but I don't know officially. What I do know was that Microsoft brought me down to the PDC. I mean, they sent me to the PDC too, and Bill Gates stood up, and in his general session, without having been asked, he said the J word. He said Java, and he said that Java will be supported as a .NET language. He didn't say exactly how. He didn't say as a Microsoft .NET language. But he did say it would be supported. He didn't say J++ will be the tool. You know, you get my meaning. So that will happen. Okay, so we're talking about EJB v2. What about implementations? Well, WebLogic has always been, BEA has always been very, very close to the standards. They've always been pushing the envelope. They've got beta EJB v2 implementations now. It is beta. The quality is not that good, but they're getting a lot of credit with the developer community because as the EJB v2 spec kind of develops, you can try things out in WebLogic immediately. And that means all the updates that I talked about, the message-driven bean, the RMI over IOP, if that floats your boat, or more interestingly, the update to container-managed persistence with all the changes that happen there. Customers are actively trying that out, that V2 EJB support in WebLogic, and WebLogic is likely to follow very closely to the official release of the specification, version 2 of the EJB specification. They're likely to follow that fairly quickly with GA product that supports it. They are alone in that respect. I don't know of any other commercial vendors that are offering commercial support of EJB v2 in the near time frame. For example, IBM WebSphere this month, last month maybe, so just shipped EJB version 1.1 support in its product. So that's brand new, just came out in the latest release of IBM WebSphere Application Server, though the EJB v 1.1 spec has been out since, I think, May '99. So that's quite a lag between spec and product, and expect that to continue with IBM in this revision of EJB v2. Other vendors have not announced. As I said, Oracle doesn't really feature EJB. It really features the database and kind of adds that on. I don't know exactly what they're doing. I'm going to find out if any of you have information on that. I'd be interested to hear that. Don't know about iPlanet either, although I would suspect they'd be a little bit more quick about supporting version 2 than IBM. So the other vendors have not announced, and the reason I think this is because CMP is much more complicated. This is a big task. So there's this idea of a persistence manager now that you've got to build when you do CMP and EJB v2, and it amounts to integrating a object relational mapping tool like TopLink or CocoBase into the EJB server and into the EJB toolset. So now you're getting even tighter, you're likely to get even tighter coupling between the tool suite and the back-end application server, particularly with CMP and the persistence manager stuff we're talking about. Again, Sun is trying to make this more portable and more interoperable, but the reality of the market is it may result in less portability and less interoperability. So the result of all this, kind of net, and I hope I'm not talking too much about market trends and vendors as opposed to code and what things look like, but the net of it is that EJB is fragmenting. The marketplace is evolving. EJB v2 adds more complexity. Other vendors look like they're a little bit shy, other than BEA, a little bit shy of that v2 spec. IBM is actively recommending design patterns that diverge from or extend EJB. So these are things, Sun is saying, look, EJB and J2EE, the greater thing outside EJB, is what you need to build your enterprise applications. Well, IBM is saying in its developer briefings, as well as in the tools that it actually ships, it's saying, no, EJB is not enough. You need these other things, and we're going to support them implicitly in our tools. So we're going to give you, for example, a recommendation at the developer conference that IBM made was don't use session beans. Don't use them. They're also making recommendations that say use this command object, which is a design pattern to compensate for a lack of in-process optimizations. Basically, every EJB, every enterprise Java bean is a remote object, and the only way to get to that, according to the spec, is via RMI. It's not via an in-process call. It's not, you've got to basically marshal and go out of process and back in, if that's what it is, with RMI in order to get to your EJB, and that's slow. IBM recognizes that. That's brain dead. I mean, you wouldn't want to architect a system that requires you to make every call a distributed call. So IBM is saying, well, we'll fix that. We'll have this command object, and we'll bastardize the EJB spec and recommend that our customers do this for performance. Well, they do similar things with access beans for record sets. All of these things, you add them all up, and basically IBM is saying, yeah, J2EE is nice, but basically you're going to need something totally different, and we've got it in our tools now. So you can we'll say we'll support EJB, but if you really want to get work done, you're going to want to use these things instead. Some of the other things IBM is doing that do not necessarily fall in line behind EJB, for example, their San Francisco project, which they're still banging on. They call it now, used to be called San Francisco, it's now called in the market WebSphere Business Components. These are off-the-shelf components that you're supposed to be able to assemble, knit together and stitch together, and then write a few lines of code that tie it all together and produce applications with very high productivity. So they've got general ledger components, they've got accounts receivable components, they've got 1,100 components, if you listen to what they say at their DevCons. 1,100 different components that people can just buy, license, and then build into their applications. Sounds like a great story, except they're not EJBs. They're not implemented as EJBs, and they do not run within the premier EJB application server that IBM markets, which is called WebSphere App Server. They run in their own container, their own server. It's a totally proprietary, distinct component model that does all the same things that you want: transactions, database access, synchronization, and so forth, persistence. It does all that, but it's totally replicated, and it's not EJB. So that's very puzzling, because they call it WebSphere Business Components, and they sell it right alongside WebSphere App Server, but the two don't go together. So be real careful of that. That's just another point where we're saying that IBM is going proprietary there. Now, how well that's doing in the market? Not very. I don't think San Francisco is doing very well, but it's still being marketed very hard by IBM. IBM is also very strongly embracing SOAP, UDDI, and the whole concept of web services in the same sense, and I use that word in the same sense that we use the idea of web services. In fact, we're cooperating quite closely with IBM in the web services space, which is, as do I need to point out, web services not mentioned in J2EE. It's not mentioned in EJB. It's just an extra thing. So this is another thing that IBM is maintaining its independence of Sun. Sun hasn't said anything about web services. They're going to drag themselves into that, just like they've done with all the other technology that we've introduced. They're likely to follow on that at some point, but at this point they don't have anything interesting to say except some rumors about this thing called Brazil, Sun's Brazil project, which is half-baked. It's a research project, and nobody seems to know much about it. But they'll use that for FUD. They'll say, oh, web services, maybe you should hear about Brazil. I mean, it's not even a real product. Some of the other signs of fragmentations, Gemstone J, as I said, Gemstone was bought by this Brocat, this German company, but their persistence cache architecture, which is very parallel to and predates EJB entity beans, it surpasses the capabilities that you can get in entity beans today. So PCA is, again, a proprietary extension. It's not EJB. It's like EJB, but it's totally different. BEA is using TopLink for CMP. So for their customers who want real persistence and want code generation or want to avoid programming all the code that writes stuff out to databases, that does the object relational mapping, rather than using just strict database calls, and rather than using EJB's entity beans, what they recommend for their higher end customers is to use this tool that is, again, totally separate. It's not EJB. It's not EJB entity beans. It's TopLink's proprietary persistence manager. So a lot of fragmentation. So Sun puts up a very united front with EJB and J2EE, and they say this is standard, and everybody's going to do this. And everybody sort of does that, except bowing to the realities of technology, IBM is saying, well, you're not going to get the performance you'll want if you stick to EJB, so use these things. BEA is saying in persistence, you're not going to get really what you want. So we recommend you use this. You know, these are things that aren't EJB. Warn your customers of that. So when they see EJB, that is not something that they can buy. That spec is not something they can buy and actually deploy. What they do is they buy a product that has EJB, the brand, stamped on it, but then when they develop and deploy applications, they're going to be developing proprietary stuff. They're going to be developing stuff that does not port, or if it does port, it doesn't perform. Okay. Any questions on before I move on? Any questions on that? Oracle does the same thing with SQL J, absolutely. So Oracle's introduced this different persistence model. It's not JDBC, it's not a Sun API, it's SQL J. So the reality behind this, you know, United Front is much different. So this is a picture of Model View Controller as applied to EJB. Model View Controller is kind of a term. How many of you have heard this before? It's a way of separating concerns within an object-oriented environment, originally applied in Smalltalk to fat client applications where there might be everything on one environment, one machine, as you tended to do in Smalltalk in the early days, 10, 12 years ago. So it's now been applied in the distributed sense, and the way it works is what we want to do is separate the concerns between the business logic, which manages data, we'll call that the model, the thing that's going to render pages to the browser, we'll call that the view, and the controller, the thing that negotiates between those other two pieces. And that's called the controller. That's implemented in JavaSpeak. This pattern is applied in Java as a servlet. So, so the kind of flow, the recommended flow for MVC in EJB is browser sends a request. It initially talks to a servlet. Now, in some cases, it may pass through a JSP, but basically a servlet is going to decide. That's where you're going to put your logic that says, is this person authenticated? Do I need to authenticate them? And if not, send them the JSP for authentication. Is this person already authenticated? If they are, then what do they really want to do? And then maybe I'll send them a different JSP that asks them to fill in a form. Or, after they've filled in a form and made a request, the servlet will look at the request and say, it wants me to go talk to some of the business objects, so I'll go talk to them directly, and that's the model. So, or the state, the objects that render state or persist state. That's how MVC is applied to EJB. Now what IBM is saying is that's not really good enough because you've got between the servlet and the business logic, those EJBs, those are all remote calls. So if you build this entity, let's suppose it's a customer with an address, and that address has a bunch of different things, different fields in it, all of which might be stored in different columns in a database table. Those will all be accessible from that business object as remote calls. So every get and every set on that bean is a remote call. Is the performance going to work on that? Absolutely not. So what IBM is saying, bowing to the reality, you need this command object. And it actually fixes the problem. But what you've got is this command object is collecting the entity bean and storing it there and making it a local call to get and set. And then once the servlet's finished, it's got to call this transfer to EJB method or something on the command object, which sends all those things over maybe in one big bundled remote call, saving greatly in performance. So I'm not saying that command object is a bad idea, but that is an extension. So that's one illustration. And you may want to use this for customers. Another thing they do is, unbelievably, row sets, which seems like such a common, vital thing to handle easily in your application environment. Row sets are not supported very well in the idea of entity beans. So remember, an entity bean generally maps to a row in a database. So imagine retrieving a row of 120, or a result set of 120 different items. That is 120 different objects in EJB land. But it's not only 120 different objects, it's 120 different objects that all expose a remote interface. Now try to get all that data back on your client and put it up on the screen. You think that'll work? I mean, it's going to take minutes to paint your screen. No kidding. So what IBM says is, no, you don't want to use that entity bean idea that's proposed in EJB to do row sets. You've got to have this thing called an access bean, and that'll aggregate all the 120 different entity objects, store them in one big collection object, and then you just marshal that over. No remote calls, just one remote call for you. And again, this is not a bad idea. In fact, similar ideas were used in Duwamish, the data abstraction layer. There's nothing wrong with it, but the point is that EJB does not answer all the programmer's problems. In fact, if you try to conform to EJB, you're going to be required to do some fancy footwork just to get things to work properly. So that's another illustration that I wanted to mention. JDO, I promised that I would talk about JDO. So JDO is this thing that's still in the draft stages. In the JCP, there's this thing called Java specification requests, and that's when Sun says, hey, I think we need to address this problem, Java community, who wants to help out on it? And so that's the stage that JDO's in. They're still forming the request, the specification, still getting a lot of input from people. You can look at a draft specification for JDO, but it's basically, think ADO for Java. It's to address limitations in JDBC and as well entity beans, so both of those things. So JDBC is very verbose, very a lot of code involved like ODBC. Entity beans have those problems with row sets that might be a small problem in different applications. JDO is going to try to address these things, but it's still very early. There are no vendor implementations of JDO because it's paperware, right? It's on paper. But some of the people that are reviewing the spec have said things like, JDO is what we really wanted when you gave us entity beans. We want row set support. We want the ability to make data objects not necessarily all be distributed, all be accessible only via a remote interface. And so Sun is moving in that direction, which I guess is good for them, but it's going to be a while. Yes? Is JDO going to provide caching the same way that entity beans do today? That's a question of active and open debate. It's not a clear answer there. The JDO people, some of them say, well, we think JDO should be used by entity beans in order to do their back-end store, which would fix some of the things, but that changes the front-end model because now it's not entity maps to one row, it's entity maps to a query, a result set, and that's a lot different. Now, there are others that say JDO should replace entity beans. So it's an area of active discussion. What it amounts to is, I'd say, uncertainty, and that's not, we're not just making that up. There is great uncertainty into the data access model for Java, and you should play that up. So the bad news, what's the bad news on Java? I've tried to describe a lot of different vendor developments and what the market is doing and so forth. The bad news is that, in fact, J2EE and EJB have succeeded as a rallying point for server-side vendors against you-know-who. Secondly, as a resurrection of the fallen Corba warriors, I like to say that because basically nobody is making money on Corba anymore. And what are they going to do with all that server-side junk? Well, they just kind of roll some EJB in there, call it an EJB server, and it's back out there. It's revamped. And finally, and this is the thing that's most troubling to me, is EJB and J2EE were very instructive in defining the application server space. So they succeeded in defining that to the point that some customers, when they confront the application server decision, they start with the idea that, well, application server, that means EJB. They equate them. And they don't even think about Microsoft and some of the Microsoft platform pieces that would directly answer their requirements. So that's a big success for EJB, despite the fact that perhaps it hasn't caught on in usage. It's definitely caught on as a marketing message as defining what an application server is. More bad news, JSP and Servlet are easy to use, they're fast, they're becoming ubiquitous. You plug it into anywhere, it runs on any operating system, runs on any web server. It's very portable. Question, what? Does it run on IIS? Damn straight it does. It's a plugin, right? So I buy this third-party plugin and just bolt it onto IIS or Netscape or Apache or whatever it is that I'm running for my web server on whatever operating system I'm running. So yeah, it does run with IIS. So for example, you could have a website, I don't know why you'd want to do this, but you could have a website where some pages are ASP and some are JSP and some are static HTML. It's just that the things with JSP would have a different rule in the configuration. It would say, go out to this DLL that implements the JSP engine. JSP and Servlet are also XML friendly. So we heard some talk about some European tour where the Java vendors are talking about Java and XML, and that's absolutely true. It's a big play in JSP with JSP and Servlet development. It's not so friendly in EJB land. In other words, it's hard to convert an EJB entity into an XML document in the same way that you convert an ADO object into XML just like that. You can't do that with EJB entity beans, but you can do some nice things in JSP and servlet. Uh-oh, more bad news. Products are now established, independent of the J2EE brand, so you're seeing some more independence. So when we say fragmentation, vendors are perhaps not relying so much on the strength of the J2EE brand to succeed in their space. They're just going out there with their own brand name. They've got WebLogic established as a strong brand. IBM's got WebSphere established as a strong brand. And these products, these application server products, are forming the basis for richer products like commerce servers or EAI servers, such as BizTalk type things and so forth. And the market is currently focused on Java, so more bad news, and I hope I'm not getting you too down here, but hang on. For example, object relational mapping tools are still very strongly focused on Java. Testing tools, code generation tools, even the customers and analysts, as I pointed out earlier, are focused on Java as the kind of center of the server-side world. The good news on that point, though, is .NET is our turning point, and I'll talk more about that later. We also have some internal sales challenges. People tend to ignore the server side. Yes?
WebSphere, WebLogic, what OS platforms are they supported on? Like, there's Performance 2000, and is there any data on performance on different platforms?
All of those products run on multiple operating systems. For example, WebLogic on NT, Windows 2000, Linux, AS400, AIX, Solaris, and OS 390, which is IBM's mainframe operating system. That's just from off the top of my head what WebLogic runs on. Their primary platforms are Solaris and secondly NT Windows 2000. But they run on a whole bunch more. IBM WebSphere, same exact way. They're going to run on every IBM platform, not OS2, but they run on AIX, they run on Linux, they run on OS 390, AS400, and then they add in Solaris. They've just added in HPUX. I may be missing some. iPlanet is doing similar things, although perhaps not as broad. But yeah, they run on all kinds of operating systems. Performance, I don't know. Performance is, I don't have clear figures on that. It depends on what you mean. There's not a clear, they haven't participated very actively in benchmarks that have been published. EJB is conspicuously absent from every benchmark that might apply, like TPCC. No EJB there, no Java there. But I still think that in dynamic page generation, I mean, you're going to get some reasonable performance, especially when compared to ASP, which is still interpreted.
It's a good session on performance, actually, Dr. Lab's report.
There's a good session on performance and the DocuLabs report. Check your thing. All right, so I got to move on. The good news, the J2EE value proposition. I think we can directly counter that. This is from Sun, right? This is what they say, 1, 2, 3. They say faster time to market, eliminate vendor lock-in, and great connectivity. Well, faster time to market, it's hard to argue with that because what they're saying is a container on the server side and these idea of server-side components. And we've been saying that for much longer than they have. They're saying that tends to increase development speed or increase programmer productivity. We agree with that. So the philosophy is very similar. But on these two other points, eliminate vendor lock-in, that's a complete fallacy. And I hope I've illustrated to you why. If you want more on that, check the notes that are in this slide deck. Check some of the background material that I'll reference at the end. It's just not happening. The large market that they talked about is actually shrinking. And in that shrinking market, there's actually tighter ties between tools and EJB application servers. So the idea of vendor lock-in, I mean, you actually are getting pretty severe vendor lock-in when you go EJB. Reduced cost of skills is not being fulfilled either. Java programmers are being paid 20 or 30% more than VB programmers in different geographic markets. So that's also the big lie. It remains to be seen what will happen over time, but today, that's a big lie. On great connectivity, there's zero official XML support in J2EE. The XML support is coming directly from the vendors in a proprietary fashion. So yeah, there's great connectivity if you want to use XML in Java, but it's not coming from Sun and it's not coming from J2EE. On JDBC, that's not an easy way to get to a database. And we know that, and you can talk about that. In the same way that ADO improves on ODBC, ADO is going to be miles ahead of JDBC. And some of these other APIs that Sun mentions as ways to connect into the enterprise are very small, non-strategic APIs, poorly supported by different vendors. So what's wrong with EJB? It's complex. People are afraid of it. especially compared with JSP Servlet. Nobody knows what to use, what pattern to use, what metaphor to use. It's insufficient. There's poor support for common scenarios like row sets. You've got to go through all these machinations just to get a row set down to your client. Now that's not going to be what you do every time. Some of these Java vendors will say, well, in my enterprise application, most of the data munging is done on the server side, and we just present a yes or a no to the client, which may be true. But there are scenarios where you're going to want a row set on the client side. You're going to want to see a result set of data, and EJB just doesn't work with that. Web service is completely absent from EJB, being supported piecewise by different vendors. For example, Iona is saying that they're behind it, and IBM is saying they're behind it. But BEA, probably the #1 EJB vendor in terms of units shipped, they're totally silent on web services. So that's not standard. What else is wrong? Well, it's very odd. You know, you've got these EJBs that are all transactionable, all distributed, all thread safe, when you don't necessarily want all that, especially when you're talking about things like row sets or lighter weight objects. RMI over IOP is just a weird Corba legacy. You know, anyone that was designing this and wanted to do so in an elegant fashion would have written another wire protocol or done something a little more elegant with RMI than what they've done with this Corba, you know, RMI combination. It's very weird, very odd. Furthermore, business methods, I mean, to just kind of get arcane, business methods are not specified in an interface. So in the way that you would describe a business interface and give it a name, whatever it is, business, IFU, and implement your methods in there, you can't do that in EJB. They're kind of, the interface is kind of a convention. It's called an interface by convention. There is no interface that lists the business methods. It's just kind of by convention that those are the things that you use. There's a home interface, which is a bona fide interface, but the remote interface, the business interface, is not. And that's just weird. That's just a weird thing. It's slow in two ways, runtime and also in the standard. We're seeing the standard is not moving as fast as people want. Okay, I talked about some of this stuff. CMP just doesn't work. And here's some more bullet points behind that. But in the end, kind of to sum it up, CMP is all about programmer productivity. That's what Sun wanted to do when they rolled CMP into EJB. They looked at it and said, well, based on our analysis, 33 to 40% of the developer time on a big enterprise project is devoted to persistence, is devoted to design and implementation of persistence. Now, that's not 33 to 40% of code, but time, developer time. How to get your objects into and out of relational store. And so they said, let's do CMP. We'll shrink that amount of time. That'll be a big programmer productivity benefit, and people will like this EJB stuff. Well, it's just not delivering, right? It's delivering a lot of complication. People can't understand it. People find it hard to use, and the performance is just terrible. So it just doesn't work. ADO offers superior function today. So this is one of those situations where I think we in Microsoft, especially in the marketing side, not necessarily in the field, but in the marketing side, have really just fallen down and have not been out there saying that ADO is miles ahead of what EJB is doing with entity beans today. It's simpler to use. There's a broader set of stores supported. You can do things like row sets. Imagine that. You can get native XML support, and we've got a vision for the future that we've already described that means you're going to continue to ramp up on programmer productivity. We're like we got this great tool here, but we're not talking about it. We're afraid of EJB when they say entity bean and stateful object. We go, ooh, we don't have that. We don't have that in our checkbox. What are we going to do? We got way better than what they've got, and it's called ADO, and we should market it and we should pitch it that way. We rule on programmer productivity. One footnote, object relational mapping tools, they still got us there, but we're doing some work on that, both open source and within VS7. There's a data set designer. You're going to see some benefit there. More on CMP. There was a recent survey done by BEA. Users are now questioning the CMP model because they know about JDO. They know about these OR tools, TopLink and CocoaBase. They know that what's possible and that CMP and EJB is just not delivering what customers want. So very tricky to say that CMP is delivering on programmer productivity. Okay, so the other thing on the good news, programmer or portability either across platforms or vendors is the big lie. It's just not happening. Every extension that these vendors make to the programming platform makes the apps non-portable. IBM publishes a 40-page document on how to port. There's a third party that that publishes a 56-page document. Basically, you should figure that porting from one EJB server to another is going to be like a relational database migration. It's just not going to happen. And that's supported by the analysts. That's supported by customer stories. And the final thing, and you should really nail this one, is performance. We are kicking butt in performance. We've got the top 5 TPCC transactional benchmarks. You should really harp on that. If you haven't seen TPCC, go out and look. There are no Corba, there are no EJB, there are no J2EE implementations in any of that TPCC stuff. There's no Java in there. So it's all the top 40 or 50 price performance benchmarks are all ours. The top 5 in raw performance are all on Windows 2000 and COM+, with a database called DB2 on the top one. But SQL Server for number 2 through 5. Okay, so .NET and J2EE, what I've done is updated that chart for the next generation technology. And what the key things that I added were, on the Java side, one thing, message beans. On our side, you can see they're all highlighted there, and there's some really good stuff in there, and we should really bang hard on that. We've made up all the ground that we were behind on this JSP code behind stuff with servlets. We made up all that ground with ASP+. With ADO+, we're going further and further ahead in the lead. With remoting, we're really showing some leadership there with web services, SOAP, over HTTP. With the language support, developers love this. This is reaching out to all these different developers who don't necessarily want to use Java. So kind of top-level differentiators, I've provided them for you for a slide here. And you guys should know these, and you should be able to just nail these. When customers ask you, what about .NET versus J2EE? Well, they're targeted at the same kinds of problems. But we think we've got real value in terms of our productivity in ASP+, in ADO+. We think multi-language is the way to go. We think web services is right. We think XML should be in the system to the core. We think all these things are important, and those guys just don't have it. On the top, I've kind of illustrated some parallels. But on the bottom, you should really focus on those differentiators. Now, I think the key areas are ASP+ and ADO+. That's where programmers are going to be spending their time. That's going to make the lion's share of the difference for their programmer productivity. And so I think we should really focus on these too. So here's my offering for how these compare. In both of them, you're going to get some of those benefits on the top, like Xcopy deployment, like just-in-time compiled, like intelligent caching, and XML friendliness. With JSP, you're going to get multi-platform, multi-operating system, and multi-web server. And you don't necessarily get that with ASP+ today. I put an asterisk there because who knows what will happen in the future. But with ASP+, you're going to get some real benefits that you just can't get with JSP and Servlet today. Web services are made so easy. This multi-language support with inheritance between them, it's so easy. Server-side controls, they don't have anything like that. That's real neat stuff that people should be excited about. The other thing is ADO+, where we're really going to nail these guys. The Java data access stuff is confusion, and we should tell our customers, we should ask them, what are you going to do for persistence? Have you looked at JD? Are you going to use entity beans or session beans? Are you going to use bean managed persistence or container managed persistence? Or maybe you're going to use an object relational mapping tool. It's really complicated. Have you thought about these things? And they're going to go, make it simple for me, make it simple for me. And you'll go, how about just ADO+? And you can show them all this neat stuff, and you can demo this stuff, and you can give them the quick start that's in the SDK, the .NET SDK, and they're going to love it. I'm telling you, this is going to make big differences for us, the ADO+ stuff. So focus on that. Now, moving on to resources, I will let you look at these briefly, but what I'm going to do is recommend that you get the slide deck, because there's a lot of things. I have 3 pages, actually. First one I'll recommend is InfoWeb. Then there's a competition kind of portal. There is a distribution list called EJB Comp. If you've got questions, you've got competitive situations, go there for email. There's a share that I have. You get these slides at that share, and you can get some other stuff there too. Check out the switcher from Free Markets. There's a bunch of other external resources. Check them all out. There's the wrap-up. Clear weaknesses on the Java side. EJB is losing its luster. .NET is going to turn the tide, compete against the products, understand the products, and go head-to-head against the products. Because you're not going to win just going against EJB. Some of these vendors have kind of improved on EJB. So go against the products. And remember, the difference is you guys. You guys have to learn this stuff. You have to understand what the competitor's doing, why our stuff is so great, and you have to be able to communicate it to the customers so you can make a big difference in this battle. And that's all I have. Thanks for your attention. Question?